Are you tired of not being able to come up with a proper plan in closed positions? In today's video, we will talk about a key rule regarding pawn structures that will allow you to come up with a proper plan in closed positions, find candidate moves, and outplay your opponents in the middle game. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. So today I'm going to be talking about a principle called rule of the chain. So let me show you what rule of the chain is. I will start by talking about this opening right here. This is the French defense. After knight to c3, knight to f6, white goes e5, the black knight goes back to d7, and this is the pawn structure that we have right here. So according to the rule of the chain, you have to follow the chain. That means that you have to identify your central pawn chain, which in this case starts on f7 and it goes e6 and d5. These are the two center pawns, and this is the central pawn chain right here. And you have to follow this pawn chain, and you have to play on the side where the pawn chain is looking towards. So for example, because the chain starts on f7, it goes this way. So it is going towards the queen side. Therefore, black has to fight back with a move like c5 and play on the queen side. For white, it is actually the opposite. White's pawn chain starts on b2. Let's for a moment imagine that this pawn is on c3. Let's just create an imaginary pawn chain here. So white's pawn chain starts on b2. It goes to c3, d4, and e5. So white's pawn chain starts on the queen side, and then it goes towards the king side. And naturally, white wants to play on the king side with moves like f4 and f5. And the most played move in this position, the theoretical move, is this move pawn to f4, taking space on the king side, preparing the f5 advancement in the future. Now, why is that the case? Why do we want to play moves like c5 or moves like f4? Why can't white just go knight to f3? Why can't black just play moves like knight to c6? That is because moves like f4 and c5 take more space, and they're necessary. The c5 especially is a pawn break, and it is a necessary move to open up this side of the board so you can activate your pieces and then activate your rooks later on in the game. For example, if you play this move knight to c6, you will quickly run into trouble, because how are you going to activate this rook right here on a8? If you play c5 on the other hand, now you have a clear plan. In the future, you will move this knight away, put the bishop on d7, and then go rook to c8. So what that might look like is something like this. For example, after cd4, let's just say knight d4, and let's say we play bishop to e7, bishop d3, knight to c5. Here white castles. We can capture this bishop and then put this bishop on d7, and then the rook will go to c8. And this all happened because we played the c5 pawn break. If there was still a pawn on c7, this maneuver would not be possible, because there would still be a pawn on d4. We would not be able to play knight to c5, and black would be extremely restricted. So pawn breaks like this allow us to actually open up the position and get some activity and space for our pieces. Same thing with the move like f4. White wants to play f4 because white wants to take more space on the king side, on this side of the board. And eventually what white might try to do is push this pawn to f5 to get a king side attack. Let me actually keep going through with this line. Something like this is very plausible, and we put the knight on c5, and as you can see, we can even take this bishop right here, and we can try to develop this bishop to d7 and bring the rook to c8, or we can go b5 and then develop this bishop to b7, put the rook on c8 that way. But none of that would be possible, or it would be significantly more difficult if we never played c5 and if we had never taken this space. And similarly for white, white wants to follow the chain. White wants to play f5 because white wants to get a huge attack. So that is why we need to follow the chain, and we need to play on the side of the board where we have more space and where we are stronger. So let me move on to some other examples. Okay, now let's take a look at this position right here. Let's say in this position, white plays this move bishop to e2, a very natural looking move, right? However, this is actually a huge mistake, because in this position, black can play this move pawn to b5. Now, I want you guys to look at black's pawn structure. So the central pawn chain starts from e7, it goes to d6, and then it goes to c5. So according to the rule of the chain, the natural follow-up would be this move b5. And in this case, as it turns out, that is the top computer move, despite sacrificing that pawn. So after white captures, black captures back, and let's say white captures this pawn on b5. Now what has happened is that both of these files have opened up. So now black has semi-open A and B files, black has open diagonals, and black will get a lot of activity. And even worse than that for white, black has a tactic here. What black can do is play this move knight takes e4, and after the knight takes back, queen to a5 check hits the bishop and also gives a check to the king. Knight has to go back to guard the bishop and block the check. However, we get rid of the knight and then we capture the bishop, and now we are in this position where we are extremely active. The material is equal, however black has significantly more activity here, and also black has a lot more targets. And most importantly, black is not allowing white to castle. Even though white can go like queen e2, it doesn't matter because black will simply capture. Go bishop to a6, the king has to move one more time. Let's say the king goes back, for example, bishop to c4. Now this pawn is under attack and this pawn is under attack. White is simply unable to defend everything. So despite the fact that we sacrificed the pawn, going back to this position right here when we played b5, despite the fact that we sacrificed this pawn, we were able to activate our pieces very quickly, and we were able to get a winning advantage very quickly. And that is the power of this concept. When you follow the chain and when you play moves like b5, moves that open up your pieces, moves that are very active, gives up material, yes, but gives a lot of activity to your pieces, you will be able to get better positions and you will be able to make your opponents make mistakes, such as bishop takes b5, which falls into this tactic right here. Let me show you some other examples. Another example where you can sacrifice a pawn for a lot of activity is this one right here. So in this position, as you can see, white's pawns are going this way. Let's imagine that instead of a bishop being on e3 right now, there's a pawn. Both of white's pawn chains are headed in this direction. Therefore, a natural follow-up here is to go h3 and g4. And that's especially because the king is over there. We want to open up that side of the board. So in a position like this, white would move the knight to the center, just make this knight more active. Let's say knight to f6 is played, and then h3, a very powerful move, preparing g4 pawn push. If black plays bishop to d7, just simply continuing to develop. After g4, this is going to be almost winning for the white pieces. After fg4, white will queenside castle, gambits this pawn as well, and then white has both open g and h files. And let me tell you something, this is not going to end very well for the black pieces, especially after bishop takes h3, rook h3. This square on e6 is extremely weak. How do you defend against knight to e6? Well, let me tell you, you don't. You will lose this game with the black pieces. And going back, if you try to defend against this h3 with a move like h5, for example, it doesn't matter, because after bishop to e2, bishop d7, g4 is going to be played anyways, and this pawn is going to be sacrificed anyways. After pawn to f5, knight e6 is still coming, and you cannot exactly stop that because the knight will land here in a couple of moves. So for example, in this position, let's just make a random move for the black pieces. This is coming, and if the bishop takes, then after fe6, this pawn is extremely powerful, and all the pawns over here are extremely weak, and they will be scooped up one after another, and white will once again have a winning position. Let me show you a couple of other examples. I'm not going to go too far in depth. However, I'm going to show you the general rule and what happens in these openings. So this is the Sicilian defense. It is the Grand Prix variation of the Sicilian. And in this position, the correct maneuver is to first and foremost play this move d3. And after a couple of moves, this maneuver of queen e1 and queen h4. So as you can see, after a couple of moves, what happens is that white is following the chain. The pawn chains starts on c2, it goes to d3, e4, and in a lot of lines, one of the typical pawn sacrifices in the Grand Prix from the white side is this move f5. And what this does is it opens up the bishop, it allows the knight to go to g5 with a threat. In a lot of positions, of course, right now it's defended, but in some positions, this knight can be removed from f6, and then the bishop will go to h6, the knight will go to g5, and there is a huge attack on the black king. Let me show you this position right here. This is the Vienna, and the same rules apply here after a move like pawn to d3, bishop to e6. Let's take a look at the pawn structure. It goes from c2, d3, e4. So we have a very similar pawn structure here, and the correct move is to play f4 to follow the chain. And from here, you can either go f5 and then go g4, g5, or you can do many things. You can go with moves like queen to e1, g4, queen h4, similar attacking plans, but you have lots of options and you are following the chain once again. Another example, I'm bringing lots of examples today, is in the Caro-Kann. So this is a typical advanced Caro-Kann. Let me go back after a move like e4, c6, d4, d5, e5. This is the advanced variation, bishop to f5, knight to f3, e6. Let's say bishop to d3. This is not a good move, but I'm just trying to illustrate an idea. So that's why I am showing this variation. After captures, the queen will capture back, and black wants to follow the central pawn chain. The pawn chain starts at f7, goes to e6, d5. What's the natural follow-up here? It is the move c5, breaking the center apart, and then you can develop knight to c6, queen b6, pressure this pawn, and go on from there. Okay, now let's talk about this position right here, and let's do a small exercise. So in this position, it is black to move. So what I want you guys to do is to pause the video and try to figure out the correct plan in this position for black, figure out a couple of candidate moves, and try to find the best move in the position. I will give you guys 3 seconds to pause this video and try to figure it out. 3, 2, 1. So the correct move in this position is this move, knight to g4. Now, after knight to g4, black is attacking this bishop on e3. If white, let's say, simply defends it, black will capture, and this is positionally very good for the black pieces because the bishop on e3 is very powerful. It controls this diagonal, it pressures h6, so you do not want to give it up as white. So because of that, here what white will do is white will move this bishop away. Let's say the bishop is moved to d2. Now you have to find this move, pawn to f5. And this is where you have to use the rule of the chain. You have to identify that the pawn chain starts at c7, it goes to d6, and then it goes to e5. The natural follow-up, let's go all the way back, the natural follow-up from this position would be to play f5. However, the knight is in the way. Let's move the knight. And how do we decide where we want to move the knight? We want to move the knight away with a tempo. If we go back here, it's not as strong because this is not a tempo, right? Because there's nothing that is being attacked. But if we go to g4, we are attacking this very, very powerful bishop, and we want to get rid of it. White will move it away. Now we can execute f5, and we have a very nice position as the black pieces. Okay, let's do a second exercise now, and once again I want you guys to use the rules that I have taught you in this video and identify the correct plan, find candidate moves, and try to find the best moves once again. So I will give you 3 seconds to pause the video and try to figure it out. 3, 2, 1. So there are actually multiple moves in this position. There is no one best move, but the idea and the plan that you're going for is this move b5. So the pawn chain starts on e7, it goes to d6, c5. The correct follow-up is to play b5. However, that is not possible right away because of how well controlled b5 is. So you have to come up with moves that support this pawn push. And there are a couple of moves here. For example, rook to b8 is a move, setting up b5. a6 is a move. Knight to e8, this is a very high level move to reroute to c7 and then go b5, that's also a move. Knight to d4 is also a move. So all of these moves are possible, and all of these moves bring you to the goal of playing b5. So if you found any of these moves, and if you were able to figure out that b5 is the correct plan and this is what you should be aiming for, congratulations, and let's move on to the next position. Another way to use the rule of the chain is to recognize your opponent's pawn breaks and try to control them in advance. So in a position like this, one of the best moves here is this move pawn to g4. And what pawn to g4 aims to do is basically it takes space on the king side, it prepares a potential attack, but it also restricts this square on f5. And if the black knight ever moves away to h7, f5 is harder to execute because of this move g4. And we know that f5 is a move that our opponent wants because of the pawn structure right here. Black's pawns are on d6 and e5, and therefore black wants to follow the chain, execute f5. But this is a bit of a weird structure because black's pawns are also on d6 and c5. So this is another pawn chain, and you could say that b5 is another pawn chain that black wants to execute. Therefore, another very powerful move, let me just go back, is to actually restrict this move b5. And let's say our opponent plays rook to b8 to prepare b5, we go a4. So we use the rule of the chain, but we don't use it for ourselves. We use it for our opponent to recognize what our opponent's plan is, and that's either to play f5 or to play b5. And now we are able to restrict both of those options with moves like g4 and a4.